welcome to another edition of the C-Vision International Cyber Thought Leadership Podcast Series. I'm your host, Igor Volovich, former CISO of Schneider Electric Americas, and currently the founder and chief strategist at Cyber Strategy Partners. Today, we're very happy to welcome to our program Mr. Michael Smith, who is the Vice President and CIO of the American Academy of Family Physicians, and a recent winner of the CIO 100 Award. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So let's talk about some of the things that we talked about before, which is strategy, leadership, and the role that IT plays in the business, and also where security fits. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, yeah. Well, I've been in the IT industry almost 25 years, and a little over 15 of those years have been in healthcare and IT. And one of the, of course, most important aspects of what value IT can provide to an organization is the overall strategy of how to enable technology to meet the organization's objectives. And so my background and my history, I didn't start in the IT industry. I actually came in from outside. And so the way I view technology and utilize technology is more from a business perspective and an operational perspective. And so it's been very easy for me to transition from being able to discuss strategy with business leadership executives and then being able to marry up how technology, again, can enable that. And so I have a lot of experience in not only developing overall strategic plans and multi-year technology roadmaps of how we can, how an organization can at least move from the overall strategic footprint of talking about what are we trying to accomplish as an organization, whether that means that we're trying to improve the value that we provide to our customers, whether that's the value we provide for our members, which would be what the AAFP is focused on, but being able to move then to execute where technology plays a part in helping to drive those organizational objectives.
So it sounds like you're really focusing on the top-down, business-first, business-driven architectures and strategies, and then you're trying to enable the business through technology, right?
Exactly.
It's not the bottom up, technology first, let's go get the best toys, the latest toys, let's invest a lot into that, and then kind of figure out where they fit. A metric that I'm frequently quoting is the shelfware percentages, the ratio of things that never come off the shelf after you acquire them. And in some places, it can be as high as 50%. Mm-hmm. It looks good on paper, it looks great on the whiteboard, and it looks great when you're signing that PO, but when you actually bring it in, turns out it may not fit. It may not be a kind of a need to product fit or need to solution fit. And what you thought was really valuable at the time of purchase may no longer be there. And also, I think there's a long acquisition cycle can also play a role in that, right? Where, when you make a decision to acquire, by the time they actually bring it in, could be a year from then, could be longer. And so then the value of that acquisition decays before you even took it on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that. Have you had those kinds of challenges? How do you accelerate the decision-making process and also make sure that your integration timeline doesn't deplete the value of that acquisition? How do you preserve the ROI?
Yeah. And of course, many in the technology profession would always understand the debate of build versus buy, right? Do you build the software solution or do you buy it? And again, I mean, there's various ways of approaching that. Some things that have to be considered is that some organizations that you work for based upon what that organization does. So let's say a pure manufacturing organization that produces product and then distributes that product out, you have a lot of choices that are available to you off the shelf, right? Whether you're talking about SAP, whether you're talking about JD Edwards, whatever it may be as an ERP system that would manage the overall supply chain of an organization. Mm-hmm. But you start getting into organizations that are much more niche in what they do and what they provide. It's not going to be very easy to find that particular product on the shelf. And so now you're in a position where you have to build that because you are a unique type of organization. Case in point, at the American Academy of Family Physicians, one of the values that we provide to our members is helping them to stay in compliance with the American Board of Family Medicine. And one of those areas of compliance is around continuing medical education. And so we not only produce content and courses that qualify for continuing medical education credits, we also partner with a lot of other companies that produce similar type of content. But for that content to actually be qualified for CME credits, that course or that content has to be accredited. And we also accredit those types of courses for our members. And so the software that manages not only reporting the continuing medical education credits, but also the whole process of how we manage an organization that wants to have their course be accredited, you're not going to find that software off the shelf because it's very niche for family medicine and for that area. So we have built systems in-house to kind of manage that. And so yeah, for us, it kind of depends upon the situation. Now, when we are talking about a buy type solution or that shelf type product, we've invested in Workday for our HCM and finance accounting platforms. We've invested in Salesforce to kind of manage our members from a CRM perspective. We utilize Sales and Service Cloud with Salesforce. We utilize the Adobe Marketing Cloud for all of our sales automation and how we communicate with our members and creating that digital experience for them. So we also use a lot of best of breed products that are then married and coupled with homegrown or built-in systems based upon the uniqueness of our organization, and integrating those two together is sometimes interesting and fun and challenging, right? To do that integration with those types of platforms, but it just adds to the complexity and the excitement of what we can do from an IT perspective for the AAFP.
So it sounds like you are embracing the cloud by doing it judiciously. It's
Yes.
not cloud for cloud's sake. We've seen certainly in our practice, and a lot of the colleagues that we've talked to even on this podcast and elsewhere, they talk about this idea of, we have to be in the cloud. And sometimes that's not driven by any kind of a technology need or a business need, but more of an idea that, well, the next time that our CIO goes to a conference, they have to be able to say that we're cloud enabled, or we're cloud native, or we're cloud destined, right? And that can create the wrong incentives. And as the saying goes, show me incentives, I'll show you outcomes. And when you're rushing to the cloud for its own sake, that can certainly be an impediment. It can have an opposite effect, right? And that's something that's always on my mind, at least when we get into these strategy conversations with clients and we talk about what are they doing? Why are they thinking about the cloud? What is it doing for you? And there are a lot of sort of these sideways look. What are you talking about? Of course, we have to be in the cloud, right? And we try to sort of deconstruct that a little bit and see if is there an actual need? What's driving that need? What's driving that belief that you have a need, right? Take it back to kind of first principles and then figure it out from there. And then figure out what kind of cloud do you need? What does that even mean? Do you need infrastructure as a service? Do you need software as a service? Do you need, or are you thinking of it just as somebody else's data center? That's also okay. Even in today's day and age, in 2021, sometimes that's just enough, right? But, you got to figure out what the requirements are. And so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on how do you make sure that it happens, that those decisions are done the right way, they've got the right people in the room, but also that the process is followed so you can ask those critical questions, that you can apply those critical thinking skills, and that you can actually maintain the integrity within that process so that all the parties kind of get to be heard, but at the same time, reason prevails, right? That it's not emotional, that it actually is a true qualified decision. How do you make that happen?
Yeah. So for me personally, anytime that I have moved into a new organization, and I guess maybe to take a step back further. So early in my career, I had an incredible opportunity to go into consulting, and again, I was brought into the consulting firm not because of my experience in technology, but the fact that I had transplanted from an operational role into IT, that the general manager of that consulting firm was looking for a consultant, at this particular case, one consultant that would kind of help bridge the gap between explaining the business value of what that consulting firm could do for that particular client, and then having the technology expertise to do that with the consultants that were already on board with that consulting firm. And so so I was brought on board for that consulting firm, which I was still kind of wet behind the ears from a technology perspective. I mean, I understood. I was kind of trained up on the infrastructure engineering side. And that was when Microsoft was first starting to explode. They hadn't even released Windows 95 yet. So it was still Windows for Workgroups and NT 3.5 and 4.0 and all that. So they hadn't even really deployed their first truly graphical interface of what we would experience today with the Windows operating system until Windows 95 came out. And so, I had kind of understood that how the networks kind of work from an infrastructure perspective. And so I could really talk the technology, but if you'd have had me to sit down and really kind of say, hey, we're going to, design this IP network like this and that, I just wasn't there at that particular point. But I really understood how to connect with businesses and understand why is it important that you need to have, this type of integrated network, or, this type of application, or how do you need to get to this type of data and stuff like that. And I could kind of bridge that gap. And so kind of having that background is I developed for myself the ability of how to quickly get up to speed with what that client's challenge was. Because again, when you're in consulting, an organization is not going to be very forgiving to say, oh, sure, we'll give you 6 months just to get up to speed, billing at an hourly rate. That's not going to work. And so I developed for myself kind of this first 100 days. Anytime I would come into an organization, I would, even during my interview process, I'd say, this is what I'm going to do in the first 100 days to get up to speed with what the organization is trying to accomplish, what your strategic plan is, what your strategic direction is, but also evaluate the talent within the IT segment that I'd be responsible for. And from there, you're starting to build kind of a high level requirements, understanding of what the organization's trying to accomplish, right? You're not getting down into the weeds, but you're really trying to understand, where are the gaps with what the organization is wanting to do versus the reality of where they're at today. And through that process, when I came onto the AAFP, I followed a similar process to kind of know that they had a lot of on-premise solutions that they wanted to enhance and improve the ability for them to create this best of breed digital experience for the organization and I knew, and for their members. And I knew that to accomplish that, we're going to have to look at best of breed technologies that are going to be more on the cloud computing side than on-premise solutions. However, because of the uniqueness of the organization, that there's certain applications that we have developed in-house that you wouldn't find off the shelf, you couldn't go 100% to the cloud because you're not going to be working with SaaS providers across the board. So we adopted a hybrid cloud computing strategy, where there were certain applications. Again, when we're talking about Workday Salesforce, you have no choice, right? There is no on-premise solution for those particular platforms. Coupled that with the applications that we have to host in our own data center, and then integrate those two together to allow them to share data and communicate with each other. That was the strategy we had done. So it's, what I would recommend to any IT leader, and I know I'm saying what they already know from this perspective, is really get an understanding of what is your organization trying to accomplish, and take yourself away from technology for the sake of technology. Mm-hmm. And say, well, what do we need to focus on from a business operational perspective? And then start kind of, looking at what is the technology that's available that's going to meet this need, so you do create this best of breed, right? That everything is not 100% the cloud, right? That's probably not reality. It may be for some companies, but not every company. And 100% on premise is going to create a lot of limitations of what you're capable of doing from a technology perspective, and kind of balancing that, which direction that we need to go. And so that would be the advice that I would provide.
I think the challenge, of course, is that we operate as technology leaders and security leaders or IT leaders, but we will operate at this intersection of the business and technology. We're kind of this the translation layer, if you will, and we have to have credibility in both worlds. What do you feel as a CIO or someone who's operating at that level? What do you need to have more credibility? Do you think there are more challenges on the business side, or do you think there are more challenges maintaining your credibility with the IT folks who are technologists, who are trying to operate technology layer? What do you think the skill set should prevail for an aspiring leader who wants to operate at that level?
I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to say both. Because here's the challenge, and this is the challenge that is faced by CIOs, that I do not believe that there's any other position in a company that has a similar challenge that the CIO has other than the CEO of a company? So case in point, when you're looking at a chief marketing officer, I mean, very talented position, right? They have to understand marketing, but they've grown up in an environment where they already know the business operations, right? Because if you're going to market that, you've got to kind of have that understanding, right? A chief financial officer is very focused on the financials. But this fact of a CIO is that that they're the expert in the technology side, but they also have to be the expert on the business operational side. Mm-hmm. And the reason why they can do that, or at least it's expected of them, is the IT function within any company is the only function that will touch every aspect of an organization. And I'm not saying that marketing doesn't, but generally marketing is more focused on an external reach, right, to the consumers or whoever that organization's selling to. And a chief financial officer or the finance function would also touch every aspect of the organization, but it's very specific to the financial health of that organization or the investment strategy that organization wants to do. But from a CIO perspective, you're not only touching all of the individual contributors within that organization. That, again, if you're in a manufacturing environment, you're working directly with the line folks on the manufacturing line at the same time that you're working with middle management, at the same time that you're working with executive leadership. And across that, every single function, it positions CIOs to be in a situation where they can wield a significant amount of influence within an organization. Here's the problem that I think CIOs have tripped up on. They're waiting for an invitation to have a seat at the table. And I've had a number of interviews and a number of podcasts that I've said this multiple times. That invitation will never come. And the reason why it will never come is that, think about when a CFO or a CMO or a chief operating officer is hired in their position. There's no question that when they're hired in that position, that they're going to have a seat at the table, right? They're never invited to have a seat at the table. It just exists. Well, why does it exist? Well, because those functions have created a reputation and a credibility within organizations to say, we have to have that position on our executive team. In the IT function, that has not always been the case, right? Because either IT leaders will come into a conversation with executives and start talking technology, and that can be extremely intimidating to a non-technologist, specifically a CEO. Think about a CEO's personality is they're supposed to have a knowledge, even maybe not expert, but at least intermediate knowledge about every aspect of their organization. They know exactly what the CFO does, the CMO, the chief operator. They understand all of that. They understand the HR component, the operational component. But when it comes to technology, it's still kind of a black box. And you never want to put a CEO in a position where they're going to look dumb in front of their, people that they're managing. So if CIOs are coming in and talking right over the head of a CEO because they think that it sounds like they're an expert, they're actually they're defeating the purpose of what they're trying to do. Is they're not meeting the CEO where they're at, they're not meeting the other executives where they're at and demonstrating value. So I think if we're going to want to have a seat at the table, number one, we're not going to be invited. We're going to, in essence, put ourselves in that position by establishing the credibility that, number one, we know what the challenges the business are facing. We are providing the solutions that is establishing that credibility that, hey, this is actually fixing issues. And then we will find ourselves more and more in those conversations that you then have that opportunity to have a seat at the table, but it's something you're going to have to work really hard to get to that point and build that credibility. The best advice that I ever had from, a very, very good mentor for me is that she had mentioned, if you ever find yourself in a meeting with an executive team or even the board of directors, and there is a technical issue in that meeting, do not, under any circumstances, try to fix the problem. Your response is, let's call IT and let's get someone from IT up here. And the reason why is that if you're under the table working on cables, or you're trying to configure a machine to do something, you suddenly have changed your entire perspective of those sitting around the table that, oh, well, that's the tech person, right? When we have a problem, we're going to call that tech person, right? And now everything that you've done from a credibility perspective is gone. So, you know, again, a chief financial officer, if there's a problem with the financials and they're reporting on it, they're not going to figure out how to fix that formula in Excel or in whatever the tool may be. They're going to say, well, look, I'll let my team take a look at that. Apparently something's not calculating right, and I'll get back to you, right? But we are kind of service-oriented individuals in the IT sector. So when we see there's a problem, we want to fix it, right? And sometimes taking that route can also kind of damage our credibility. That you know, it's a challenge, and I think it's a challenge for CIOs that is vastly different than any other functional leader within an organization.
You've said it, right? The idea of building credibility and earning your seat at the table, that's central to this whole idea, right? How do you become a leader in this space? How do you become a technology leader while maintaining some credibility in the technical space, maintaining awareness, continuing to observe trends, understand the technology, kind of the moving landscape of technology, how to apply it, becoming that kind of translation layer for the company. But at the same time, how do you gain that business acumen? And you almost have to develop on two parallel tracks. And at some point, there's this inflection point that happens, right? Where this tipping point where you realize, I am now developing as a leader. And you have to take the initiative to develop those skills, because frankly, nobody's going to teach you, right? And if you're lucky enough, I was blessed enough to be in an environment back at Microsoft where they identified some skills and acumens and some talents that I had, and they put me in some training. And so I got to learn the other side of technology. They're talking about technology, delivering value through technology. How do you describe a technology solution without actually getting too techy about it, right? How do you stay out of the weeds? And how do you talk to business leaders? So, but that's rare. Most folks don't do that, right? They don't get that opportunity. And I'm a big fan of Michel Robert's work. You know, back in the day, he wrote a number of books about the new strategic thinking. And he talked about his consulting experiences going into large companies like 3M, for instance, where everybody in the boardroom and well, most people in the C-suite definitely are chemical engineers. They got there by being experts in their domain. That's how you excel. That's how you become recognized. That's your performance metrics. And then next day, you find yourself in a senior position. And suddenly you're not really doing the work, you're mostly orchestrating. And that orchestration function requires some different thinking. It requires less analysis and more synthesis. And there's that tipping point that happens, right? So how do you enable folks to develop into a good, solid, all-around leader where leadership comes first, right? And technology sort of supports that function. I think that's one of the challenges that a lot of folks are having. You know, I talk to a lot of people on the talent side, HR, recruiting, et cetera, executive headhunting, where they talk about the challenges of identifying good candidates and bringing them in. And the challenge there is, we know a metric for a good CMO. We know a metric for a good CFO. We know a metric for a good CEO, right? You know, they doubled the company stock over the last 6 months or 12 months, right? Things like that. What's a good metric for a CIO? How do you communicate your own value as a person, as a leader, as a team member? But also, how do you develop those skills so you can become a well-performing CIO? And I think that's a question I'd love to ask you. How do you know if you're doing a good job as a CIO? What are some of the metrics you look for, and how do you demonstrate value to your organization?
It's all around the consistency of execution. So it doesn't matter what the the solution is, because from an IT perspective, we could have on one given day IT focused on an infrastructure issue that has brought the entire organization to its knees, right? And so all hands on deck trying to figure out what that particular issue is. And the next day we could be then addressing you know, the next generation of an application or a platform that organization needs to develop. So I mean, it's just, there's never a repeat day in the IT industry. It just seems like there's always something new and something challenging, and just the ability of consistently executing to provide value to an organization, that's the metric to track. Now, it's fair to say, well, geez, Michael, that's a broad, big thing on there. but everything being done with excellence, everything being done with a focus on customer service is the number one priority. When you're able to consistently execute on what the challenges that the organization faces, that's when the phone is picked up by the leadership within the organization, calling the CIO and saying, look, we're thinking about doing this within our organization. We want to get your thoughts, right? Because you've established that credibility that now they're bringing you in, or they're bringing your team in to those early initial discussions when no one else in the company knows anything about this, right? And it may never even see the light of day. They're just trying to strategize. What are we doing, or where are we trying to go as an organization? And you've established that credibility because of that consistent execution, that when we have a challenge that we need someone to solve, our IT function within our organization consistently delivers on that. And I want to tap into that talent, and I want to tap into that expertise, because we want to make sure we get it right the first time. And there's a lot of CIOs and organizations that are starting to experience that now. They're starting to see that they're getting a lot more respect from that executive leadership of the value that they're providing. And matter of fact, I read an article a couple of months ago that was saying that there's this shift in the next generation of CEOs, that historically CEOs have come from three distinct functions: general manager function, right, of an operational perspective, marketing or sales, right, or the financial sector, right? And those three have traditionally been where the CEOs have come from in their expertise to become, the top leader in a company. They're starting to see the shift that now a lot of CEOs are starting to come from the technology ranks. Mm-hmm. And so it is possible that over the next 10, 15, 20 years, there's this shift in the market that many CEOs, if you look at their LinkedIn profile, may show that they were in consulting, or they were in as a technology leader and had moved into that operational leadership role as a CEO. There would be no surprise to that, because again, IT can see all of the various functions that are happening in an organization, and they're well balanced as an individual of knowing what are the challenges that an organization is truly facing.
Well, the only way to do that, of course, is to ask the questions, right? And get
Mm-hmm.
to know your business and build that credibility over time, right? Trust is not built overnight, right? Right. I recently watched a podcast that talked about the Navy SEALs and how they approach trust versus performance. And Simon Sinek recently also did a talk about that, where he talked about the value that they place in a high-performing organization like DevGru or SEAL Team 6. They look at, of course, everybody has to meet a certain standard of performance to begin with, just to be there. But then there was a range of performance capability, and they would rather take somebody who is a middle performing individual, but who is highly trusted, because when things happen, you have to trust them first, and then performance has to come second. And especially when we don't know how to measure performance in a concise and sort of a quantified manner at this level, what makes a good CISO, what makes a good CIO. And you talked about some of those things, but there's not a metric, there's not a dashboard, right? There's no scorecard that says, this CIO is great. And, we vote on it, and we certainly are happy to talk about some of the qualities and some of the acumens that really come into play, but there isn't really an easy way to know. Not as easy as it is on the, let's say on the sales side, here's a metric for the quarter. We meet our metric or we beat it, right? Mm-hmm. It's a lot more difficult for us. And, we're sort of thrust into this midst of a lot of unknowns. Some of them are known unknowns, some of them are unknown unknowns. Mm-hmm. And we have to make those things work, and we have to make things a little more predictable. And actually, one of the engagements that I had, we actually used to say that, our function is to make the unknown predictable. Mm-hmm. And people would kind of do a double take and say, what do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And we say, well, just let's deconstruct that statement, right? We're operating with a lot of unknowns. Most of those we don't control, right? Mm-hmm. They're outside, the trends, the technology trends, the threats, especially in the CISO's world, things that are not within our operational control at all. We could do the best job ever, but we're not going to be able to influence those kinds of things. So we have to influence what we can, which is our own environment, our own culture, our own ability to integrate technology into the environment in a way that creates value. And then the most important thing is, how do we communicate all of that? Right? I think that's the continuing challenge, and you certainly spoke about it at length. Where do you see technology moving in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years? And what do you see some of the trends that are impacting your life right now, and some of the things that you might be seeing on the horizon coming up that you can see changing your world, changing your life, maybe changing your environment in a measurable way?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has kind of experienced the past 18 months of the pandemic, and how, I mean, it was a beautiful opportunity for the IT function around the world to demonstrate their value to organizations of being able to quickly shift to a remote environment. We were fortunate at the AAFP, because part of that technology transformation that my team led, we were in a position 6 months before the pandemic came to actually just make the switch from one day to the next, because we had the technology in place. Some other companies, they weren't as fortunate, or the leadership within that organization may have not thought, had not taken the advice of that IT leader of the importance of having that resiliency, and that ability of making sure that operations can continue to function whether or not you're in the building or not. And it's more than just disaster recovery or resiliency from that, but it's just how the organization functions as an organism, right? How people communicate and collaborate with each other. Do they have to be in a conference room every single time a meeting happens? Can they, be able to work from where they're at? And it's just changing that entire mindset. And so as we move forward, the environment now of what we see, I don't think we'll ever go back 100% to the way that it was. I think there's going to be now companies, even the AAFP is talking about this hybrid work environment, where there'll be a certain number of days in the office and other days where you have the flexibility of working from home. That didn't exist prior to the pandemic, because that just, again, wasn't their culture, and makes complete sense from how they operate as an organization. But now you're having all these companies have these discussions that this is where technology plays a key role going into the near future of how do we go from what we're doing right now, right? Where we're having an audio and video conference type concept with the platforms there, to where now we're having meetings to where in a virtual reality perspective, we're all in a room, right? But we're really not in a room, right? And we're all kind of either avatars, or we're all using some type of virtual reality to interact with each other, but we're in different parts of the world. So I can see where that collaboration moves into that next phase where it becomes much more mainstream. Mm-hmm. And then even further down from there, of course, we have just, hit the tip of the iceberg on artificial intelligence and machine learning and what it's capable of doing. And I know a lot of people, not only in the IT sector, but I think in just any industry and any sector, there's this underlying fear that if we do too much with AI and machine learning, I'm going to be out of a job, right? Mm-hmm. And but the reality is that explosion of innovation in AI and machine learning will create jobs that we don't even know exist today, right? And it's probably going to end up creating more jobs than what we even have that exist today. And perfect example is, I think it was, and I may have the year wrong, but I think it was 1906. The largest employee base of any industry in, I won't say the world, but at least in the United States, was elevator operators. There were more people employed as elevator operators than any other industry in the United States in 1906. There is no more elevator operators, right? There haven't been in my lifetime, right? Unless maybe you're at a very fancy hotel and it's more of a concierge type service. But otherwise, you get into an elevator and you push a button and it takes you where you want to go. And you don't need someone to do that for you. Well, the same thing's going to happen with AI and machine learning, that we're looking at jobs that exist today that won't exist in the future. But think about that elevator operator. People said, yeah, but it was horrible because they lost their job. Well, did they lose their job? Maybe they were retrained, because you had to have engineers to develop the technology that would actually do what the person did previously, right? That when you would hit that button, someone had to create that. Someone had to manufacture that. Someone had to build that. And that created all these new jobs that there was no reason for those jobs to exist in the past. And that's where I think as we look into the future of taking advantage of technology, to better everyone, not only from a convenience perspective, but from an employment perspective, is that AI and machine learning are not the threat. They're actually the advantage to exploding so many other industries and so many other job opportunities for people to take advantage of.
No doubt.
Exactly.
We've certainly seen a huge jump into things like the cloud over the last 18 months. And, some folks are having second thoughts about it now and saying maybe we rushed a little bit, but yet it did expose what's possible, even though it was forced kind of at the point of a gun, but it did happen, right? And a lot of folks found themselves maybe being forced to do things they weren't ready for. But the pandemic has been called kind of a great cloud accelerator or a great technology accelerator, which is unfortunate, but here we are, right? We're now learning about different work models, about different ways to work together, collaborate. Data is moving at an ever increasing pace, and that's not going away, right? And it's really hard for us to take that step back, I think, cognitively and culturally, to say, well, let's just go back to the way things were. People have discovered new models, new work models, new collaboration models, and it works. I mean, we heard about all these, naysayers saying, the productivity is going to go down, right? People are going to kind of sit at home, play Xbox, read their paper and not put the work in. And of course, there was some backlash around monitoring technology, employee monitoring technology. Folks were kind of freaking out about that, kind of exert control about their employee base. But ultimately, we're here now and things are working fine. For the largest part, it's working fine. So it's hard to make an argument against it, right? And I think embracing these kinds of advancements, if we can, it's a no-brainer, right? Yeah. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about security, right? At least a couple of questions. So there's this ongoing debate, certainly on the security side of things, and I'm even troubled by the fact that we say security side of things, right? To me, it's all one thing, right? Technology is a piece of it, right? But it's really more about than just technology. So, but there was definitely a debate within the security industry about this upcoming convergence, this idea that maybe security and information technology are really one and the same, and we really do need to eliminate security as a separate function, that it really needs to be integrated, built in, embedded. And there was this kind of a trajectory, I guess, from the time that we asked to be recognized as its own standalone function, that we had our own thing, right? We worked in our own right, and we have to be recognized as its own thing, its own function, right? And then we said, well, now you got to embed security in. And now we're talking about, well, maybe there's nothing to embed. Maybe it's built in from the start. Before we even start building anything, security is already there. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that. Obviously you lead a technology function, security fits, of course, all across the board for you. I'm curious what you think about that. Do you think we're going there? And maybe, what's kind of the horizon for that? How soon do you think we might actually get there? And do you think there's any value in that?
Well, yes, I think there's value from the perspective of just having a holistic view, right? A fully integrated view of how technology and security, which again, for me, it's very difficult to separate those two, right? From that perspective. Now, I did see a poll on LinkedIn yesterday that was asking the question of, do you think a CISO should report to the CEO, the COO, the CIO, the chief financial officer? And I think the top two answers were the CEO or the CIO, and the other three options were relatively small. I mean, it was a huge difference between the top two. And my first thought was, that's the wrong question to be asking. Right? Yes. Okay. A CISO, everyone has a boss, right? Even at the top level. If you were thinking a chairman of the board of the largest company in the world still has a boss, it's the shareholders, right? So everybody has a boss. So I understand from an organizational perspective, you have to have that reporting function. But instead, it's the fact of how can we best utilize and integrate the necessary technologies to now have an environment that is fully secure, fully functional, and people don't even realize it. Case in point, the iPhone or the Android, right? You think about all the functions that now exist in this one single device. They used to be separate, right? You wanted to make a phone call, you're going to use a rotary phone. I grew up on a rotary phone. I grew up in a small town where we had a, a party line, right? You had to pick up the phone to see if somebody else was on before you could make a phone call, right? And you had the long cord, right? That if you had a really long cord of 50 feet, you felt like you were mobile, right? But you're still attached to that device. But then if you wanted to take a picture, you got to get something else, a camera. If you wanted to send someone a message, you got to get a pen and paper out, right? Or type it and mail it. And now with this iPhone, you do all three in one single device. So when I think of technology, business operations, and security, it's all tightly integrated. It all comes together. Now, the question would be, should the CISO and the CIO, report as peer groups and to the CEO? My answer would be, okay, sure, right? Should they report into the CIO? Okay, sure, right? It doesn't really matter from the perspective of what is the organization or that culture trying to accomplish, and how can all the parties, the CEO, the CIO, the chief technology officer, the CISO, how can they work as one single organism to really understand what are the challenges an organization is facing, and then go out and conquer those challenges and build those solutions, just like we see today in the iPhone and the Android, of bringing what used to be considered disparate, different things within our life into one single device, that now people can't even think of the fact of, why would I pick up a camera and take a picture unless I'm a professional photographer, when I've got my camera and the phone that happens to be the same person or the same thing that I'm using to now have a conversation at the same time I'm taking a picture and send that, where now I don't have to take that photo and put it in the mail. I just send it to them electronically, and I did it all from one single device. That's how I look at technology, security, operations, getting to that point where we're all one fluid organization, and who's reporting to who. Okay, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's up to the culture of that organization. So that's my response to that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think we're talking about more and more about this idea of things being secure just from the start, right? And so moving from this cognitive notion of security as a function or as an attribute or something that you add on or you even embed into, which is still a great idea, right? You embed it in and you do it from the start, but moving from this idea into this notion of things just being secure.
Yeah. And again, it's just my response to that would be, well, yeah, right? Because and again, I think we all recognize in the IT industry, we're always going to have bad actors. They're going to exist, and they're getting smarter, and they're getting more efficient, and they're getting more innovative. That next year we're going to have issues that we can't even think about having today, because that's how fast things are evolving so quickly. So yeah, the notion that everything that we develop and design has to be led with this concept of making sure it's secure, my response would be, well, yeah, absolutely. Why wouldn't we? And so yeah.
Yeah, it's a great idea on paper, right? I mean, the idea now is how do we make that happen, right? And so how do we? And there's actually a conversation happening right now in certain corners of our industry where we talk about kind of a converged function within the leadership echelon, where the CIO and the CISO is actually merged, single seat, right? And basically CIOs have to become more security aware and vice versa. And maybe it's kind of this co-CIO CISO arrangement where they are peers and they do operate from the same idea, the same playbook. They have their own perspective on it, but yet they're working towards a common goal. And I think a lot of folks invested into this juxtaposition on this adversarial model. IT wants to do IT stuff, security wants to do security stuff, and security stands there and says, "Thou shalt not pass," and they're the keepers of the realm and all that stuff. And there's a lot of mythology built around that. But ultimately, we're all here for one reason only. We're here to support and enable and drive the business. And if you can't map your function to a value chain within your environment, then I don't know what you're doing. And nobody else does either.
That I've never had an issue reporting to someone related to being an employee of an organization. And what I'm saying is that I haven't really had any aspirations of being an entrepreneur and owning my own company and being my own boss, right? There's people that do, and I get that. But at the end of the day, from my personality, if I was in a position where I was the CIO and I was reporting to the CISO on there, Would I care? No. Is that CISO going to have my best interest and allow me to be innovative and have a voice with that CISO, knowing that they're going to have to make the final decision because they're my boss? That's fine, right? I mean, I've reported to a chief strategy officer, I reported to a CFO, I've reported to a chief operating officer, I reported to a CEO. It's all based upon the relationship you have with that person, and is that person positioning you to be successful? You know, if all of those are yeses, then it's like, well, who cares who reports to who? Let's all be on the same page to provide the most value that we can provide to the organization that we work for and to society in general, right? Because we're all doing things that is helping all of us to be more efficient, more collaborative, more connected with each other through the use of technology.
Well, I think that's a great parting thought, and I think we'll end it there. But I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. This has been very insightful, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. This has been great. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity.